Okay, well, first, my most sincere apologies. This session runs a little longer than what I like them to. I was trying to cover the basics of synthesis concepts that we've learned over the past few weeks, as well as show you something new. So I promise next time, next couple, they'll be shorter. So let's get started. Okay, well, before we get started here, I want to make sure that this thing is going to be about the basics of synthesis that we've already learned and how to apply that to Zen Add Sub Effects when you're not using the presets. Zen Add Sub Effects is huge and overwhelming if we don't have those things firmly in mind. So to start with, if you haven't seen the synth soundfonts and swami or the second amsynth videos, I urge you to see those first. They'll give you the background we need to do this. And the amsynth, I think, is called Basics. But make sure that's firmly in mind. And with that, let's go forward. Okay. Here is a 1/100th of a second of a real dobro note played. And you can see it's all spiky. 100 years ago, they figured out they could have an electronic instrument that would make a nice, smooth pulse wave, but it didn't sound very musical. So here's a sine wave, and they figured out they could get it to be more musical if they stacked on other waves, the what we call the partials, the fundamentals of this wave. This is a 220 hertz wave, 100th of a second. And here's 440, 880, 1760. And if they stack those up, it would begin to approach what this looks like over in these real dobro tracks. So let's actually stack those up. And notice that, it begins to approach, it's more complex. Actually, that wasn't. Let me come up here. Anyway, you get the idea. You stack these sine waves up, and they get more complex, but they're not nearly as close as this. So that wasn't working for them with additive synthesis, or not fully working for them to actually mimic the sound of a real instrument. And so they went to subtractive synthesis and pulse width modulation and FM synthesis and these other things, trying to create sounds electronically that were, if not exactly like instruments, then at least pleasing to the ear. So with that being said, let's shut this down. And bring up amsynth that I hope you remember that we talked about. Here's a single oscillator. Here, this is in some respects with one oscillator only. This is subtractive synthesis. We have this oscillator. We have a low pass filter. We run a frequency through here, try to carve out, attenuate some of the higher frequencies, run it through an envelope generator, and run it through an LFO down here to give it a little more musical sound. When we bring in two oscillators, and here's the oscillator mix, if you remember from our amsynth stuff, now we're additive and we're still subtractive. So in Zen, the thing that looks so intimidating here, and the thing is that all these knobs, all this stuff, and these things are buried down in Windows. I'm not sure why. The guy who designed this was brilliant. So, but maybe not a UX guy. Anyway, to understand how Zen works with respect to synthesis, what we've already understood, we have to go edit an instrument. And notice I have additive synthesis enabled here for this new imaginary instrument. I'm going to go edit it. Now I have show voice list and show voice parameters. If I show voice list, it says I only have one voice. In Zen Add Sub Effects, this equates to I only have one oscillator. He calls what we've previously understood to be oscillators voices, and I think in a minute you'll see why, because it's quite a bit more than a simple oscillator. But right now we only have one oscillator or voice turned on, and we're going to go show voice parameters. So I bring this up, and boy, does it look big. But let's take it a step at a time. First, we'll come over here and let's change from a sine wave. And it's not immediately obvious on the screen how one does that. You really need to take a minute and look at this stuff. But let's change this. And here I've got sine, and I can say, I'll make it a pulse wave that we've seen, or a triangle wave that you've seen. And this, as we go, this is the base function, a triangle wave. It might be a little high there, but and this is all these choices we're going to make in here. This is what the resulting wave is. So we can come in here and we can say, take this. This is kind of like an EQ, kind of like notice how it brings that up. Brings that up. And so with this voice, with this oscillator, we've started with a sine wave, and just by making a few choices here, this is now the sound. So that's voice number one. And up here, if you look, if I enable the filter, this is the cutoff frequency that I hope is familiar to you from our times before. Here's an envelope, attack, decay, sustain, release. I hope that looks familiar. Over here is the modulator. Then you might remember, let's make it a ring modulator, because you have seen that. And we'll enable its envelope. Again, attack, decay, sustain, release. So all these things should look familiar to you. There's just a lot more of them here than what you might be used to. So back again. We edit an instrument. We say, I want to do the additive synthesis. I show my voice list. If I want to, I can bring up a second voice. Notice, I think you might remember from the third amsynth, we did 2 pulse waves and we detuned them slightly. This is where that would take place, the detune between the voices. We'll get into that. If not at the end of this session, certainly in a session soon. We show the voice parameters. Here's the first voice. Here's that second voice. Again, I can go and I can change it, and I can make it some other bass function. And again, just like we saw in calf monosynth, there are a lot more here than just your typical triangle pulse saw waves. We can come down here and get all kinds of things. And notice how easy, with respect to that dobro sound you saw a minute ago, it is to quickly begin to approach the complexity of what we saw with that dobro. Might not be the same thing, certainly won't be the same thing, but in terms of being able to make complex waveforms that begin to sound good to the human ear, you can really do it quick with this tool. So for the same reasons I loved amsynth, its ability to understand what synthesis is at its basic, where it came from with the hardware, that whole concept of how to make instruments that sound good to the human ear, that approximate real instruments, that is exactly where we are here with Zen adds of effects. So with that being said, let me close this out, bring it up live, and we'll just go listen to some things. Okay, well, let's get started. This is kind of a live example. I hope it's obvious by now, or painfully obvious, that these are pretty much unscripted sessions. So if I can stumble through this, you can too. So what we're going to do is we're going to take what we were doing in amsynth, I think we'll take the two saws that we were playing with back in amsynth 2 and put them up here and show you that we can do that same thing in Zen. So if you remember, we go to edit instrument. Here's the instrument we're going to make. We're going to edit it, use additive synthesis. We're going to show a voice list. I have one oscillator set there. I'll set on another oscillator. Let's go to the voice parameters. Here I have voice 1, so let's change that to start with to a saw. Notice it's not exactly a saw now, it's a triangle. Hopefully even the most mathematically challenged among us understand that saws and triangles have a lot in common. Isosceles, equilateral, right triangles, whatever. So let's move that over and make it a saw, or we can move it over this way. Take your preference. Let's try this. And let's go to voice 2 and make it a saw as well. Should we try the triangle? And see, that doesn't get us where we want. Let's go to the saw and we'll move it over. Now we have two saw waves. Not quite what we wanted. Let's go to the voice list again and let's bring up the same detuning we used before. We'll detune them a bit. And that should begin to sound like what we saw last time. The nice thing about this is we can stack up as many as we want. We'll put in a couple more. Come over here to voice parameters and go to voice 3. Change. Make it a saw. And go to voice 4, change it, make it a saw, come in and we can go to our voice list and let's detune them all a little bit. It's important when you put up these voices that if you're going to put up the same waveform that you not double one of these, or you'll be getting, obviously too strong in one and not strong enough in the other. So let's try that. Here's our instrument. So hopefully that sounds like what we thought multiple saw waves should sound like from our last experiments. And I'm going to close this here because that's all I really wanted to do this session, was show you that even though we call it voices here instead of oscillators, and even though these knobs all have, see, abbreviations, A, D, S, R, instead of attack, decay, sustain, release, you're really looking at the same things that you were looking at before. Oh, I do want to show you one other thing. Let's pick a voice parameters. And this is kind of key to as we go forward and develop these things, that we have these envelopes within a single one of these multiple oscillators, or here we can set them globally for the whole instrument. So if we want to set a low pass filter or a high pass filter, we can do that on any one of the individual oscillators through the show voice parameter screen. Or we can do it after we've combined all those oscillators by bringing it into the voice list. So that's one thing. The other thing is here, notice we can increase the relative strength of these various oscillators coming in here through the volume knob. So right here we've got a lot of control over every individual oscillator, and right here we've got a lot of control over how those oscillators mix. Then here a ton of control over the various filters and features we can put on there. So that's it for this week. No, not that's not it. Let's do one more thing. Let me turn off these. And I do want to show you one thing. So notice I only have one oscillator. And let's go look at the voice parameters for it. I want to show you this unison thing, because what we just did is really similar to this unison. On the old synthesizers, when they were still doing oscillators and hardware, it was difficult to get a real fat sound cheaply. I mean, they're reasonably enough to put out. I mean, if you think those old synths were hugely expensive. So they were trying to get the best sound they could with having to create the fewest things in hardware. So what they discovered was they could do a unison thing, which is basically, instead of putting out one saw, they could put out two saws with the same oscillator, run one through let's say a slight delay to detune it a little bit, another circuit to detune it a little bit, and get a fatter sound. So let's listen to a single saw wave right here. And let's turn on unison. And hopefully you can hear that's at least more than one, and they're slightly detuned, just like we were. So let's go up here. And that was how in the old hardware synths, they could get a much fatter sound with only having a single oscillator. So while we did it with putting up multiple oscillators here, you can get the same thing. You can stack up many more than 8 simply by using this unison thing. So if you wanted, say, 6 triangles and 3 sine waves, you could do that simply by having 2 oscillators going and using the unison feature. So, okay, there's something. That's a freebie for this week. Once again, the history of oscillators and their implementation in hardware, and how we see that in soft synths these days. So that's it. Don't be intimidated by Zen Add Sub Effects. Just understand that everything you already know is here. You just kind of got to learn what to call it. Voice lists for the number of oscillators, voice parameters for how an individual oscillator works, and combining those oscillators into a single instrument. And as over the next couple weeks, we'll talk about how we can have multiple instruments in here. I don't know where we're going. This was as far ahead as I've planned, but I'm sure by next week I'll figure something out. That's it. Have a blast. Okay, well, that's it for this week. As always, if your stuff doesn't look like my stuff or doesn't act like my stuff, look here first for the versions. Secondly, here's the websites. Get involved. I hope you'll roll up your sleeves and actually try some of this stuff. You can't just watch these videos and go away. Finally, my apologies again for keeping you so long. Next ones will be shorter, but we covered a lot of material, and I hope it was worth it. It was good for me. See you next time.